What actually makes a man dangerous? It isn't the money. Plenty of men get money. It isn't even the bodies. Anybody with a gun and no conscience can leave bodies behind. In that world, the most dangerous man is the one you cannot turn, the one with no price. Because every empire, every corner, every quiet table runs on a single fear. The fear that when the law finally squeezes, your man will hold. And there is exactly one way to find out if he will. You take everything from him. You corner him. You leave him one move, one name. Give it up, and you walk back out into the sunlight. That is the test. The only test that counts. And almost every man you have ever heard of, the loud ones, the kings, the so-called untouchables, when it comes down to that last door, they take it, they talk. There was one man who didn't. One man whose only play left was to open his mouth, and he closed it instead and carried a life sentence to the grave with the name still locked inside him. Today we talk about that kind of man, the kind the streets actually mean when they say the word dangerous. His name was Frank James. January 1984, a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan. He stands up to be sentenced, 44 years old. Calm, the kind of calm that makes a room nervous. He is about to hear the two worst words in the English language, life without. And every person in that room knows there is one move that makes it disappear. One name. He has it. The prosecutors know he has it. The judge knows he has it. All he has to do is open his mouth. He doesn't. To understand why a man chooses a cage over a single sentence, you have to understand what his own best friend had just done to him. Because in 1970s Harlem, Frank James was one of 7 men who owned the streets. They called it the Council. 7 men, 1 table. They ran the most profitable supply operation the city had ever seen. Product moved out of Harlem and across the whole state. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, as far west as Arizona, even up into Canada. They modeled it on the Italians. 1 vote per man. Disputes settled at the table. Problems handled quietly. And they had a motto, 4 words. The whole code right there. Treat my brother as I treat myself. That was the deal. That was the religion. You eat, your brother eats. You bleed, your brother bleeds. Nobody talks. Nobody folds. Ever. The man at the head of that table was Leroy Barnes. The papers called him Mr. Untouchable. He put himself on the cover of a magazine wearing tinted glasses, daring the government to come get him. The government came. In 1977, they finally nailed Barnes. 1978, the judge dropped the hammer, life in prison without parole. And that should have been the end of it. The king goes down, the king stays solid, the brotherhood holds. That was the code. But the code only works if everybody believes in it. Sitting in his cell, Barnes started to hear things. That his money wasn't being looked after. That the council had stopped paying his lawyers. And the one that cut deepest, that one of his own brothers had taken up with his woman while he sat behind the wall. The man who wrote, "Treat my brother as I treat myself," decided his brothers had broken faith first. So he broke everything. Barnes became a witness for the government. Mr. Untouchable became Mr. Tell-All. And he did not do it small. He handed the federal government a list, 109 names, 109. His partners, his soldiers, his suppliers. He put his own wife's name on that list. To make the story stick, he stood up under OAS and tied himself to 8 killings just so he could explain in detail what the men around that table had done. He buried himself to bury them. It worked. Barnes's testimony helped indict more than 40 traffickers. The council he built with his own hands, he took it apart, name by name from a witness chair, and near the top of that list was Frank James. Now here is where most men have a choice, and most men choose to live. The feds came at James with a fresh case built on Barnes's word. They had the most famous informant in America pointing straight at him. The smart move, the easy move, was to do what Barnes did. Sit down, trade, give them somebody bigger or somebody smaller, and walk into a shorter number. The DEA wanted that. That is how these cases are supposed to end. One man flips, then the next, the whole table folding like dominoes until there is nobody left standing. Frank James would not fold. And this is the part you have to sit with. This is what the whole thing was really about. The government had already won. They had the king. They had the empire on paper. What they wanted from James was the thing that actually matters. Proof that the code could be broken all the way down. That if you squeeze hard enough, every man has a price. Flip the king, flip the soldier, flip the next one, and you teach a whole generation that nobody holds. James refused to teach them that lesson. That is what made him the dangerous one. Not the product, not the money. The money was gone. The danger was that here was a man you could strip of everything. His freedom, his future, his name in the papers, and he still would not give you the one thing you came for. A man with nothing left to lose and still no price. That is the man the streets are talking about when they say the word. That is the man the system is built to break and can't. He fought it. In open court, his lawyers said they wanted to put Leroy Barnes himself on the stand, to argue the whole thing was a setup, that the government had pushed him into it. He didn't beg. He didn't deal. He made them prove it. They did. The same testimony that broke the council broke James too. January 1984, life without parole, plus 40 years on top of that, a $135,000 fine stacked on a man who was never walking out anyway. And there is one more detail that tells you exactly what kind of room it was. The council was tied to more than 10 killings. The prosecutor said so out loud. But not a single one of those men was convicted of a single murder. Why? Because too much time had passed. The clock had run out on the killings. They could prove the bodies existed. They just could not charge them anymore. So the murders evaporated, and the men went down for the supply instead. Frank James heard life without parole, and he gave the court the same thing he gave the streets his whole life. Nothing. Silence. He kept the name. Think about the two men standing on either side of this story. One built the brotherhood, wrote the motto, preached the code to every man who sat at his table. And when the walls closed in, he turned that code inside out and used it as a weapon. 109 names, his own wife, 8 murders he confessed to just to make the rest sound true. The other man barely made the headlines. No magazine cover, no tinted glasses, no nickname the papers loved, just a quiet partner who got handed a life sentence on his best friend's word and refused to pass that pain down the line to anybody else. In 1998, Leroy Barnes walked out of prison. Brand new name, brand new face for the world. The Federal Witness Protection Program folded him into ordinary American life so completely that for years, almost nobody knew whether he was alive or dead. He got his second act. He earned it the only way the system rewards, by giving them everyone he ever loved. Frank James got no second act. He stayed exactly where the judge put him, buried in a federal number, holding a secret that could have bought his freedom, refusing to spend it. And that is the part nobody on YouTube will tell you. Everybody knows Mr. Untouchable. Everybody knows the man who talked. Almost nobody remembers the man at the same table who didn't. The man who heard life without parole and decided that some words are worth more than your own freedom. The man who treated his brothers better than his brother ever treated him. Harlem, 112th Street, 1989. A man is standing on a corner, ashy knuckles, no haircut, dressed like he just came back from the laundromat. Nobody looks at him twice. Around him, Dapper Dan, foreign cars, men whose jewelry announces what they are before they open their mouths, BMWs pulling up, the whole block turning to watch. He doesn't turn. He just watches. Calm, still, the way a man watches something that belongs to him. Because it does. All of it. Every kilo moving through Harlem. Every operator building a corner. Every kingpin pulling up in a car that cost more than most people in this neighborhood will make in 10 years. Connected to this man that nobody is looking at. 1,600 kilos every month. All 5 boroughs. The Medellin cartel on one end, Harlem on the other. And this man, ashy knuckles, no haircut, dressed like nobody, standing in the middle of it. The streets called him Fritz. And the day he almost lost everything was not the day they shot him 5 times on this same block. Not the afternoon Alpo Martinez walked into a room surrounded by shooters and was told, very quietly, that he might not be walking back out. It was an ordinary day. A parking lot. A car that looked abandoned. A trunk. And nearly $1 million that 2 police officers found and decided to keep. Richard Fritz Simmons was born in Charleston, South Carolina in the late 1950s. His nickname came from a 1970s animated film called Fritz the Cat, the specific detail that tells you something about who he was in Harlem before the money arrived. A boy with a personality vivid enough to earn a name from a movie. Someone people noticed before he had anything to offer them. As a young kid, Fritz visited his father in Harlem during summer months. The city pulled at him the way it pulls at everyone who grows up visiting it from somewhere smaller. By junior high school, he made the decision permanent. He moved to Harlem with his sister Evelyn. St. Nick Projects, 112th Street. He arrived with nothing. He left with everything, but not before building everything from scratch. In junior high, Fritz noticed something. He went to parties, and the people throwing those parties were making money from the people attending. He had an idea. He could throw parties too. Fritz and his friends Rob, Curtis, and Danny started throwing parties at the St. Nick Community Center. They made a few $100s the first night. Good money for teenagers in the 1970s. The party hustle worked until it didn't. At one of his parties, a gun was drawn. Fritz was hit in the head with the weapon. When he regained consciousness, he beat the man who had hit him so badly that the police were called. Fritz spent a few days on Rikers Island. He came out calmer than he went in, because Fritz understood something from that incident that most men in his position didn't understand. Violence was useful, but it was also expensive. It attracted attention. It created consequences, and consequences were the one thing that a man building something real could not afford. He filed that lesson away. The Queen Bee. By the late 1970s, Fritz and his sister Evelyn moved from St. Nick Projects to 112th Street. That move changed everything. Another resident of that building was a woman that Harlem knew by one name, the Queen Bee, Joan Morland, the first black woman to purchase kilos of heroin directly from the Lucchese crime family, not buying from an intermediary who bought from the Lucchese's directly, walking into rooms with Italian organized crime figures and negotiating prices and quantities the way that men twice her size and decades older struggled to do. Some people in Harlem said she was larger than Nicky Barnes. Nicky Barnes, the man whose face was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. The man whose notoriety triggered a personal order from President Jimmy Carter to dismantle his operation, the most famous Harlem drug figure of his era. Some said Joan Morland was bigger. Fritz met her through her nephew, whom Fritz began helping to sell heroin. The Queen Bee saw something in the young man from Charleston immediately. She took him under her wing, made him her mentee. And Fritz, who had been absorbing lessons his entire life, who had come to Harlem specifically to learn what the city had to teach, absorbed everything she knew. Then he applied it. He was working with a friend on the block when he had an idea that nobody had tried before. Give the heroin away, free, just for a day, just to attract customers, just to let people know that what they were selling was real, was the best, was worth coming back for. Less than a few hours later, 100 to 112th Street had customers lined up that had never been there before. The line doubled, then tripled. Within days, their weekly profit went from $10,000 to over $60,000. As teenagers, in the late 1970s, $60,000 per week before Fritz was 20 years old. Other dealers on the block watched what Fritz was doing. They grew respect for him the way you grow respect for someone who outworks and outthinks everyone around them. Then they joined him. Fritz was moving so fast, he outgrew the Queen Bee and her Connect. She introduced him to a new one. This Connect gave Fritz bad product, deliberately cutting the quality to keep him in debt, to keep him dependent, to prevent a young man who was clearly going to become something enormous from becoming it too fast. Fritz recognized the play immediately. He told the Connect, "Once I pay you, our business is done." The Connect sent shooters. Fritz was shot 5 times on 112th Street. He survived hours of surgery, numerous blood transfusions, and was relocated to his mother's house in South Carolina to recover. He came back. When Fritz returned to Harlem, he came back different. Not broken, not cautious in the way that surviving a shooting makes most men cautious, focused. He had contacts now that operated on a different level from anything the Queen Bee had introduced him to. He was being supplied directly from the Medellin cartel, the most powerful cocaine organization on earth. Pablo Escobar's organization, the source that everyone in New York's drug trade was downstream from, filtered through layers of intermediaries who each took their percentage and added their markup. Fritz went to the source. $6,000 profit per key to start. He gave it all away on consignment. Not because he was generous in the naive sense, because Fritz understood an economic truth that most operators in his position never grasped. The richest man in any market is not the man who holds the most product. It is the man who moves the most product. And the man who moves the most product is the man who has the most operators working beneath him, each of them selling, each of them generating returns, each of them coming back because the product is the best and the prices are fair and the arrangement is one that creates millionaires. Fritz was creating bosses. That was his specific genius. He started operators small, a few keys on consignment, enough to build a customer base, enough to prove they could move it and pay him back reliably. Once they proved themselves, he scaled them up. Multiple kilos, more consignment, more trust. If they failed, if they ran off, if they spent the money, if they couldn't pay, he had an enforcer named Chuck, Chuck didn't kill people for delinquent payments. Fritz understood that killing brought attention, and attention brought law enforcement, and law enforcement was the one variable no operation could survive indefinitely. Chuck sent messages. A visit from Chuck was usually all that was needed. The word that Fritz gave on credit, that his product was 99.9% pure, that you could stretch it and still have the best product on your block, spread through all 5 boroughs the way that quality always spreads. All 5 boroughs: Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, Manhattan, Harlem, Spanish Harlem, the Dominicans in Washington Heights. Every major player in New York City's drug trade in the 1980s was connected to Fritz. 1,600 keys per month. The Membersonly account described it with a specific reverence. He made more millionaires than Lotto. And here is the detail that captures everything about who Fritz was. Men were standing on the block with Fritz standing right there in front of them, moving his product, not knowing that the product they were moving was his. They didn't know he was the plug. He dressed regular, ashy knuckles, no haircut, no jewelry, no car that announced what he was. The most powerful drug figure in Harlem looked like he was one of the workers. That was intentional. He never allowed flashy cars on 112th Street. If you came to do business, park the flashy car somewhere else. Don't bring that type of noise on his block. The book, The Harlem Plug, described him precisely. A one-man syndicate, no partners, no gang ties, well protected because of his association with the Colombian cartel. One man, 1,600 keys per month, supplying all 5 boroughs. In 1985, Fritz opened a nightclub, the Uptown Garage, 127th Street and Convent Avenue. It became the hottest spot in the city. Young hustlers pulled up in what witnesses described as spaceships, BMWs, Mercedes, Porsches. The interiors designed by Dapper Dan, the Harlem designer who was putting MCM, Gucci, and Louis Vuitton on the interiors of cars when the legitimate fashion world was still refusing to license their logos to black customers. If it was foreign, young kids in Harlem were pulling up in it. One well-known Brooklyn hustler said, when he went to Harlem, it was like a movie. Among the men in that world, among the operators that Fritz had created and elevated, was a young man from Harlem whose name would eventually become inseparable from what that era produced. Richard Porter. Rich Porter. Fritz supplied Rich Porter, not as a charity case, not as a protege in the mentor sense, as one of the operators in the network that Fritz had built, a man who had proved himself capable of moving volume, of paying reliably, of building his own customer base on the foundation that Fritz's product made possible. Fritz didn't create Rich Porter's ambition or his personality or the specific charisma that made Harlem love him, but he created the conditions that made Rich Porter possible. Without Fritz, there is no Harlem cocaine economy at that scale. Without Fritz, there is no Rich Porter at that level. Without Fritz, there is no Paid in Full. The story that the world knows, the movie, the mythology, the specific Harlem 1980s narrative that has been told and retold for 30 years, starts with Fritz. December 1989. Rich Porter's 12-year-old brother Donald is kidnapped on his way to school. Harlem stops. Rich goes to Fritz, his connect, his supplier, the man who had built the network that made Rich's operation possible. Fritz didn't hesitate. He gave Rich a Louis Vuitton bag, inside close to $200,000 in cash, and 30 keys of cocaine. A gift. Free. Nothing owed. nothing expected in return. The street value of 30 keys in 1989 was approximately $690,000. Fritz gave Rich close to $900,000 worth of money and product as a gift and told him one thing: get your brother back and get out of the game. He saw what was coming. He understood the heat that the kidnapping of a 12-year-old child was going to bring to Harlem. The law enforcement pressure, the media attention, the specific kind of scrutiny that destroyed operations that had survived everything else. He told Rich to take the money and disappear. Rich took the bag, but he didn't disappear. He gave the 30 keys to Alpo. Alpo sold them in D.C. When Fritz found out, he set up a meeting. 131st Street, Madison Avenue, the east side of Harlem. Alpo arrived. He didn't know what was waiting for him. Fritz, his top earner ace, and numerous shooters placed outside around the store and the block. The order was specific. If Fritz does not walk out of that store, Alpo and everyone he came with do not walk out of that store. The conversation inside was heated. Alpo said the words that told Fritz everything he needed to know about who Alberto Martinez actually was. Dead men can't pay. Referring to Rich, Fritz didn't like Alpo's flashy character, had never trusted it, had specifically refused to do business with him because a man who needed to be seen was a man who couldn't be controlled. He let Alpo walk out because dead men can't pay, and Alpo owed him, but he never did business with Alpo Martinez again. It was an opportunity Alpo missed. The same period, the same informant who would eventually lead cops to Fritz's car was moving through Harlem's underground like a ghost. Nobody knew who he was, but he was connected to everyone. Fritz, Rich Porter, the major players whose operations were built on top of each other like floors in a building, each one dependent on the ones below. The informant knew the patterns. Fritz switched cars constantly, played his rearview mirrors, circled blocks, took different routes every time. He was the most surveillance-conscious operator in Harlem, a man who had built 1,600 keys per month, in part by being impossible to follow. But the informant did not need to follow him. He knew the parking lot. He knew the car. He knew the money would be there. The cops arrived before Fritz could react. They asked for the keys. He gave them. They opened the trunk. $1 million. The officers did not log the evidence. They took the money. They gave Fritz his car keys back and left him standing in the parking lot in Harlem with nothing. Fritz smirked, stayed calm, memorized their faces. He had cops on payroll. His mind was already working through who these officers were and what his own network of law enforcement contacts could tell him about them. The loss did not break him, did not flinch, did not panic, did not cooperate, because nearly $1 million for the man receiving 1,600 keys per month from the Medellin cartel was a loss he could absorb. What he could not absorb was the knowledge that someone close to him had made it happen. Connect the dots, Membersonly said it directly. Fritz loses almost $1 million to dirty cops. A couple weeks later, Rich Porter is stopped by police. $80,000 and his car taken. Same informant, same period, same network being systematically robbed. The cops were not the only criminals in Harlem in 1989, 1991. Fritz was planning to exit. Real estate. The building he had bought on 119th Street. The properties he had been acquiring. Legitimate assets built from the money that 1,600 keys per month generates when a man is disciplined enough to convert it into something that outlasts the game. He went to prison. 3 months later, his enforcer Chuck was murdered. 3 months after that, Fritz became ill, losing weight, in and out of the hospital. The specific deterioration that Harlem watched with the specific grief that communities reserve for men who have taken care of them. Because Fritz had done that. He paid rent for people, covered college tuition, gave money to help people start businesses, helped them purchase homes. He threw thousands of dollars out the window on 112th Street in the final months, as if he could feel what was coming, and the money did not matter anymore because he still had millions, and the time to spend it was running out. The Colombian cartel member came to the hospital, not as a business associate, as a friend. He sat beside Fritz and wished him a speedy recovery. Fritz passed away from an unknown blood poison, not AIDS, as Harlem rumored. And then the final betrayal. The millions he had made, stolen by trusted members of his inner circle after he died. The properties he had bought, taken. His family, left with nothing. The money he had specifically set aside for them never reached them. Fritz built an empire that made more millionaires than Lotto. He created the conditions that produced Rich Porter and Azier Faison and every other operator in Harlem's most famous era. He refused to do business with Alpo Martinez, the man whose violence eventually destroyed everything Fritz had built. He survived 5 gunshot wounds, a $1 million theft by dirty cops, and the kidnapping crisis that unraveled Harlem's most famous operator. And he died with nothing, because the people he trusted most, the people he had made rich, took everything after he was gone. That is the story of Richard Fritz Simmons, the consignment king, the man who created Rich Porter's world, the man history forgot while celebrating everyone he made. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them. Harlem, 144th Street. A line is forming, not a line outside a club, not a line outside a store on a Saturday morning, a line of people from every borough of New York City who have made a specific trip to this specific block on this specific day, because there is something on 144th Street that cannot be found anywhere else in the city. The operation running on this block is generating $1 million per week. On a bad day, not a good week, not an exceptional month, not a record-breaking quarter. A bad day, $1 million per week on a bad day. And the man responsible for all of it, the man who built the organizational architecture that turned one Harlem block into the most profitable operation in New York City, is somewhere in this neighborhood right now. You cannot find him, not because he is hiding, because he built his operation with 3 layers of insulation between himself and anyone trying to reach him. You would need to go through 3 separate people before you even got close to the man in charge. And even if you got through all 3, you still might not know which man in that circle was actually running everything, because everyone around him looked like a boss. Fly, fresh, paid. All of them. Every single person in his organization carried themselves with the specific presentation that the man at the top demanded, not because he wanted confusion, because he understood that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was be the only person in the room who looked like he had money. His name was Brooks Davis. The streets called him Sickle. And this is the story of the man who made $1 million a week on a bad day in Harlem while making sure nobody could find him. Harlem in the crack era was producing operators at a speed that the legitimate economy could not absorb. Young men who understood supply and demand before they understood anything else, who saw the specific mathematics of what was available to them and made calculations that the neighborhood could not argue with. Brooks Davis was not one of those men. He was something different. He came up in the golden era of Harlem's underground economy, the specific intersection of the heroin era and the crack era, where the men who survived were not the reckless ones, but the calculated ones. The men who lasted were not the loudest, not the most violent, not the ones who announced themselves with the specific performance of power that most young men in that world mistook for actual power. The men who lasted were the ones who built systems. He entered the game young, smart, ambitious, but the quality that separated him from every other ambitious young man in Harlem was the one quality that the street almost never produces: patience. He was not chasing fast money. He was building structure. He understood from the beginning, before most men in his position ever understood it at all, that the difference between a man who gets money and a man who builds something was not the product, not the connect, not the territory. It was the organization, the system that kept running when you were not there, the specific architecture of trust and discipline and role clarity that allowed an operation to function at scale without its leader being present for every transaction. The invisible infrastructure that most operators never built because they were too focused on the transaction in front of them to think about the system behind it. He studied how the successful men around him operated, not the ones who made money for 2 years and then disappeared into the federal system. The ones who lasted, the ones whose organizations kept generating even when the heat came, the ones whose names carried weight across multiple boroughs, not because of a single spectacular moment, but because of years of consistent, disciplined, systematic operation. He observed, he absorbed, he applied, he focused on controlling the flow, not the hand-to-hand, not the individual transaction that most operators thought of as the business. The flow, the invisible current of money and product moving through a system that he designed and built and maintained, the way an engineer maintains infrastructure, not by doing the work himself, but by making sure the system worked without him. By the time he was done building, 144th Street was not a corner operation. It was a gold mine. 144th Street, one block in Harlem. The people who came to that block came from everywhere, not just the neighborhood, not just uptown. Every borough of New York City sending people to 144th Street because what was available there could not be found anywhere else. The product on this block was not cut to the margins that maximized dealer profit. It was not stretched or diluted or reduced to the standard purity that most of New York's underground market had accepted as the norm. It was real, and real was what people traveled for. The lines that formed on 144th Street were not the lines of a neighborhood operation serving local demand. They were the lines of a distribution hub, the specific geography that emerges when word spreads across a city that one location has something everyone else is missing. Queens was sending people, Brooklyn was sending people, the Bronx was sending people, all of them making the specific trip to Harlem to 144th Street, because what was on that block was worth the journey. The money moved so fast, it was not counted in stacks. It was counted in systems. Think about what that sentence means. When you count money in stacks, you count by denomination, by bundle, by the specific physical organization of cash that most people associate with large amounts of money. Stacks are what you count when you have a lot. Systems are what you count when you have so much that stacks are not efficient. When the cash coming in is arriving faster than it can be physically organized into stacks. When the volume is so large that the counting process itself requires its own organizational infrastructure, you are no longer running a corner operation. You are running a business, $1 million per week. On a bad day, not a good week, not an exceptional month, not a record-breaking quarter that the organization pointed to as its peak. A bad day, $1 million per week was what the operation generated when things were slow, when the traffic was lighter than usual, when the specific variables that affect any business were not working in the organization's favor. On a good week, the number was something else entirely. To understand what $1 million per week meant in the context of the crack era in Harlem, consider the men who were generating those kinds of numbers across New York City at that time. The names that ended up on federal indictments, the organizations that generated the specific law enforcement attention that comes when the money gets big enough. Those men were known. Their names traveled. Their stories became the oral history that hip-hop eventually put on wax. Brooks Davis generated $1 million per week on a bad day. And Harlem never said his name. That is the specific impossible contradiction at the center of his story. Not the money, the invisibility, because the money was extraordinary, but the invisibility at that scale, the specific ability to generate $1 million per week on a bad day while remaining unknown outside the 3 blocks surrounding 144th Street, that was the achievement. That was what separated Brooks Davis from every other operator in his era. 3 layers. That was the specific insulation between Brooks Davis and anyone trying to reach him. You could not call him. You went through a person who went through a person who went through a person, and at the end of that chain, if the chain held, maybe you got access to the man in charge. Maybe, because even if you got through all 3 layers, you would walk into a room full of men who all looked exactly the same. Fly, fresh, paid. Brooks Davis demanded it, not of himself alone, of everyone in his circle. Every person associated with his operation carried themselves with the specific presentation that his organization required. Custom chains, heavy rings, the specific uniform of a man who had built something real. All of them. So when you finally got through those 3 layers and arrived at wherever Brooks Davis was, you looked around the room and you could not tell which man was actually in charge. That was deliberate. It was not vanity. It was not the specific performance of wealth that most operators use to announce their position. It was operational security in the form of presentation. If every man in the room looks equally powerful, the man you are trying to identify is protected by his own organization's appearance. The whole crew was bossed up, and Sickle was somewhere inside that. The mink suit. That detail tells you everything about who Brooks Davis was outside the organizational architecture. Full mink. Not a mink coat, not a mink jacket, a mink suit, including the pants. In Harlem in the 1980s, where the specific fashion of the crack era was already producing extraordinary visible wealth, a full mink suit, including pants, was a statement that existed in its own category. He wore double rollies, 2 Rolex watches, 1 on each wrist, the specific extravagance of a man who had decided that one was not enough, not because he needed to check the time twice, but because the weight of 2 Rolexes on 2 wrists communicated something specific about what he had built. Custom chains, heavy rings, ankle bracelets. The young men on the block would wait specifically to see which car he pulled up in that day. Not to see him, to see the car, because the car changed. Every day, a different car pulled up on 144th Street. The specific anticipation of which one, the specific variety of what Brooks Davis might arrive in on any given afternoon, was its own kind of entertainment for the neighborhood. He hosted community events. He gave back. The specific presence of a man who had built something real in a neighborhood, who understood that the relationship between an operator and his community was not adversarial but mutual, was visible in how Harlem related to Brooks Davis. He was not feared, he was respected. There is a difference. Fear produces compliance. Respect produces loyalty. And loyalty, the specific loyalty of a community that has watched a man build something and give back from what he built, is what maintained the organizational discipline of 144th Street even when the pressure was rising. He moved money out of the streets and into the legitimate world, not sloppily, not in the way that most operators move money, converting cash into cars and jewelry that could be seized, into assets that announced their origin to anyone paying attention. Strategically, he understood something that most men in his position never fully grasped until it was too late. The government does not only come for what you have, it comes for what you cannot explain. The specific liability of the underground economy is not the operation itself. It is the gap between what you visibly have and what you can legitimately account for. Tax evasion took Al Capone. Money laundering took more of the men who followed. Brooks Davis built a different kind of operation. Restaurants, real businesses, with real customers, with real revenue flowing through real registers. The specific infrastructure of food service, the cash-intensive, high-volume, daily transaction nature of a restaurant provided the perfect vehicle for moving money from one world to the other. High-end jewelry stores in the Diamond District. The specific geography of Midtown Manhattan, where legitimate diamond and jewelry businesses operated, and where a man with cash could build a presence that generated legitimate-looking revenue while also providing the specific infrastructure for converting one form of wealth into another. Real estate. The most reliable wealth-building tool in American history. The specific asset class that converts cash into something that generates income, appreciates in value, and provides a documented paper trail of legitimate wealth accumulation. His own fish store, not glamorous, not the kind of business that anyone would associate with a man who was generating $1 million per week on a bad day. But that was exactly the point. A fish store in Harlem, a neighborhood business serving the community, was the specific kind of legitimate operation that generated enough daily cash to absorb money moving from elsewhere without raising the questions that a more conspicuous business would invite. Each business was real. Each business generated real revenue from real customers. And each business also provided the specific infrastructure that allowed money to move from the underground economy into the legitimate world with enough layers between the origin and the destination to make the journey difficult to trace. He was thinking about the long game, the specific long-term thinking of a man who understood that the street was a starting point, not a destination. That the money generated on 144th Street was not the end of the story, but the capital for a story that extended into the legitimate world. The Diamond District, the fish store, the restaurants, the real estate. Each business was chosen deliberately, not randomly, not because the opportunity presented itself, but because each one served a specific function in the larger architecture of what Brooks Davis was building. The jewelry stores in the Diamond District gave him access to one of the most cash-intensive, legitimate businesses in New York City. The diamond trade runs on cash, always has. The specific culture of Midtown's jewelry district, where transactions happen in person, where cash changes hands in volumes that would trigger suspicion in any other context, made it the ideal environment for a man who needed to move cash from underground to legitimate without creating obvious fingerprints. The fish store was something different entirely, not glamorous, not the kind of business that announces wealth or status or the specific success that Brooks Davis had built on 144th Street. Just a fish store. The kind of neighborhood business that everyone uses, nobody pays much attention to, and that generates enough daily cash transactions that the money moving through it is difficult to distinguish from the money coming into it. The restaurants served the same function with the added benefit of being community anchors, places that employed people, that served the neighborhood. That gave Brooks Davis a visible, legitimate presence in Harlem that was completely consistent with the community investment he was already making through the events he hosted and the support he provided. The real estate was the long game. Property that generated income regardless of what happened on 144th Street. That could not be spent in a single bad night. That would still be there when everything else was gone. That was not a man who was going to spend everything he made and end up with nothing when the end came. That was a man who was building something that could survive the end. It ended the way it always ends. Not from outside, from inside. The federal investigation that eventually dismantled what Brooks Davis had built on 144th Street did not begin with surveillance of Brooks Davis. It did not begin with a wiretap on his phone, or a camera on his block, or a confidential informant who had been watching from the outside. It began with someone who knew the operation from inside. Someone who had been through all 3 layers of insulation. Who knew which man in that room full of equally dressed, equally paid, equally presented men was actually running everything? Who had the specific access that only comes from being genuinely trusted by the organization, from being inside the circle that Brooks Davis had spent years building and protecting? That person talked. One conversation, one decision made in the specific moment when the pressure of what they were facing felt heavier than the loyalty they had built over years. 25 years of work. That is what one conversation cost. The federal investigation targeted the conspiracy operating around 143rd and 144th Streets. The specific legal architecture of a federal conspiracy charge that allows the government to connect everyone inside an organization to the same indictment, from the man running the operation to the man holding the product on the corner, through the simple fact of knowing and participating. The layers of insulation that had kept Brooks Davis invisible, the 3 people between him and anyone trying to reach him, the room full of men who all looked equally powerful, could not survive an internal cooperator who had already been inside those layers. Someone who had already gotten through. Someone the government now owned. Brooks Davis was arrested. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. 25 years. For 1 block in Harlem. For $1 million per week on a bad day. For the most profitable single-block operation in New York City history. The government gave him 25 years. And here is what that sentence tells you about what he had built. 25 years is not a sentence the federal government gives to small operators. It is not a sentence for a man who was running a corner. It is not a sentence for someone who was caught with product and money, and nothing else. 25 years is a sentence for a man who built something that the federal government recognized as significant, who organized, managed, and directed an enterprise at a scale that the specific legal threshold of the kingpin statute was designed to address. The government's accounting of what Brooks Davis had built, translated into years at sentencing, was 25, and he served them, every single one. There is a photograph, taken during a visit to Brooks Davis while he was incarcerated in a federal facility. In that photograph, in a prison visiting room, in the specific controlled environment where men serve the time the government has assigned them, Brooks Davis is wearing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. Not a single symbolic chain. Not a modest piece that said, "I remember who I am." Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. In a federal prison visiting room, the man who wore double Raleighs and full mink suits and changed cars every day, so the neighborhood had something to look forward to, was still that man. In a prison visiting room, with the specific casual relationship to extraordinary wealth that a man develops when the wealth has been part of him long enough to become his natural state. The government had taken 25 years of his life. They could not take what he was. He came home after 25 years. He lives quietly now. No loud interviews, no documentaries with his face on camera, no specific media presence that would allow the world to attach an image to a name that most of the world never heard. Still in the shadows, still invisible the way he was always invisible, not because the world has forgotten him, but because he designed his life that way from the beginning. 3 layers between himself and anyone trying to reach him. A room full of men who all looked equally powerful. A presence so carefully managed that even the people watching could not always identify the man in charge. He is still seen in Harlem, wearing his legendary apple piece chain, the specific jewelry that became his signature, that the people who know him recognize the moment they see it, is still around his neck. He came home after 25 years and put the chain back on, because some things do not change, because a man who built what Brooks Davis built, who turned one Harlem block into $1 million per week, who moved through New York City with 3 layers of insulation between himself and everyone trying to find him, who sat in a federal prison visiting room wearing hundreds of thousands in jewelry, does not come home and become someone different. He comes home and becomes himself again. Brooks Sickle Davis, the man who turned one block into $1 million per week, the man who made sure 3 people stood between him and anyone trying to find him, the man who dressed his entire organization like bosses so nobody could tell which one was actually in charge, the man who moved street money into restaurants and jewelry stores and real estate and fish stores while Harlem watched his cars change every day, the man who served 25 years and came home to put his chain back on. Harlem never said his name loud, but Harlem always knew exactly who he was. New York City, 1990. A man is sitting in a barbershop chair. He is not thinking about the street right now. He is not thinking about his operation, or his workers, or the money moving through his corners. He is just a man getting a haircut. The specific relaxation of a man who has built something real and allows himself, in this one moment, in this one chair, in this one barbershop, to stop calculating and just exist. The door opens. Men walk in, badges out, police, or so he thinks. By the time he understands what is actually happening, what these men with badges actually are, it is too late. He is in handcuffs. He is being walked out of the barbershop in broad daylight, past the barber who cannot move, past the other customers who cannot speak, past the street that keeps moving because from the outside this looks like an arrest and nobody interferes with an arrest, into a car, gone. The ransom call comes hours later, 6 figures. Pay it, or never see him again. This was not an isolated incident. This was not a one-time robbery by desperate men making a reckless decision. This was a business model. The most feared extortion crew in New York City history operated this way, systematically, methodically, repeatedly, across the South Bronx, across Washington Heights, across Harlem, kidnapping the most dangerous men in the city's underground economy and collecting ransoms that reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per victim. They were called the Wild Cowboys. 42 members. A Harvard University press book was written about what they did, and then they made one mistake. They went after the wrong man. To understand what the Wild Cowboys were, you have to understand what New York City was in 1990. The crack era had transformed the city into a war zone. Not metaphorically, literally. The numbers tell the story that words cannot fully capture. In 1990, the 34th Precinct in Washington Heights reported 10,027 crimes in just over 3 square miles of land. 103 of those crimes were murders. 103 people killed in 3 square miles in 1 year. If you took that murder rate and applied it to all of New York City, the annual total would have been catastrophic beyond anything the city had ever recorded. The crack economy had produced something that nobody fully anticipated. Not just violence, organization. The men who controlled the corners understood that the drug trade was a business, and that a business required infrastructure, protection, supply chains, distribution systems, the specific operational discipline that kept money moving even when the government was watching and rivals were circling. Washington Heights was the epicenter. The neighborhood in Upper Manhattan, densely populated and predominantly Dominican, sitting next to the George Washington Bridge, had become the cocaine capital of the eastern United States. The West 170s between Broadway and Amsterdam were not just a neighborhood, they were a distribution center. It was the geography through which the cocaine that supplied the entire eastern seaboard passed before reaching final destinations in a dozen cities. Crack itself is said to have Dominican origins, with Washington Heights as its birthplace in the mid-1980s. The money that followed was extraordinary. The violence that followed the money was worse. And out of that specific combination of extraordinary money and extraordinary violence came the Wild Cowboys. Lenny Sepulveda and his brother Nelson went to George Washington High School in Washington Heights. They grew up watching what the crack economy was doing to their neighborhood, watching the money that moved through those streets, watching the specific hierarchy of power that the drug trade had created, who sat at the top, who answered to whom, who had the product and who needed it, and what the distance between those two positions was worth. They built a crew around the people they had known longest, the boys they had gone to school with, the men from the same blocks and the same buildings who shared the same specific understanding of Washington Heights that only comes from growing up in it. Daniel Rincon. The streets called him Fat Danny. Wilfredo de Los Angeles. Platano. Jose Yaca. Pascualito. 42 members at their peak. Not a street gang in the traditional sense, an organization with hierarchy, with specific roles, with the operational structure of men who had thought seriously about what they were building and how they wanted it to run. They rose fast. They controlled entire blocks in Washington Heights and the South Bronx simultaneously, the West 170s between Broadway and Amsterdam, buildings in the South Bronx near St. Anne's Park, corners across Upper Manhattan and the Bronx that generated millions of dollars per week through the specific crack distribution network they had built from high school friendships and neighborhood connections. But what separated the Wild Cowboys from every other crew operating in New York City during the crack era was not just the scale of what they sold, it was what they did to everyone around them. They pistol-whipped their own workers, not as punishment for specific failures, as management, as the specific tool they used to maintain the organizational discipline that their operation required. You worked for the Wild Cowboys. You did not complain about the Wild Cowboys. You did not speak to anyone outside the Wild Cowboys about what you knew of the Wild Cowboys. They murdered rivals, not reluctantly, not as a last resort after other options had failed. as a first response to any challenge to their territorial control. They shot and slashed witnesses to their crimes. Anyone who had seen something they were not supposed to see. Anyone whose testimony could build the case that law enforcement was trying to build. Anyone who represented a thread that, if pulled, could begin to unravel what they had constructed. Nobody talked. In the 34th precinct, in the specific geography where the Wild Cowboys operated, 103 people were murdered in a single year. The people who survived understood exactly what talking about what they had seen would produce. They did not talk. And then the Wild Cowboys developed a second business. On top of the drug operation, on top of the corners and the buildings and the millions per week, they built an extortion enterprise that targeted the most successful operators in New York City's underground economy. The logic was specific and calculated. Drug dealers could not call the police. A man who had his money stolen, who had been held at gunpoint and stripped of everything he had built, could not walk into a police precinct and report the crime. Because reporting the crime meant explaining the money, explaining where it came from, explaining the operation that generated it, explaining the supply chain and the workers and the specific illegal infrastructure that had made a man wealthy enough to be worth kidnapping in the first place. The Wild Cowboys understood that asymmetry perfectly. They targeted men who were generating serious money, not corner boys, not small operators working someone else's product. The men at the top of the underground economy, the men whose operations generated the kind of cash that justified the specific risk and preparation that taking them required. And they posed as police officers, not casually, systematically, with badges and the specific authority of men who had studied how police conducted stops, how they held their credentials, how they issued instructions, how they positioned themselves to prevent flight, and had replicated that authority with enough precision to fool their targets until the handcuffs were already on. They studied drug dealers. They studied their movements over days and weeks. They learned the specific routines, the barbershop appointment every 2 weeks, the restaurant where they ate lunch on Thursdays, the block where they parked their car before going upstairs, where a man's guard was down and the surrounding public would not immediately understand what they were witnessing. Then they moved, fast, coordinated, rehearsed, badges out, handcuffs ready. The dealer went into their car, thinking he was being arrested. By the time he understood what was happening, he was somewhere nobody knew to look. December 1990. A dealer is in a laundromat, an ordinary afternoon errand, the kind of task that fills the hours between the more significant moments of a man's day. He is not on the corner. He is not in a meeting. He is doing laundry. The Wild Cowboys have been watching him for weeks. They know this laundromat. They know which days he comes. They know approximately how long he stays. They know who he is connected to and what he is worth and what the men who care about him will pay to get him back. They come in with badges. He goes out in handcuffs, while his clothes are still in the machine. The ransom call goes out to his associates within hours. $650,000. $650,000 for a man who was doing laundry. His associates paid it, because what was the alternative? 3 months later, a Bronx dealer is sitting in his own restaurant. A man who had built enough success that he could invest in a legitimate business, and that he could sit at a table in a place with his name on it and eat lunch and feel the specific satisfaction of having made something that existed in both worlds simultaneously. The Wild Cowboys came into the restaurant, badges out, $750,000. And while they waited for the money, while the ransom call was being made and the associates were scrambling to put together $750,000, They did not simply hold their victims in a room, they worked them. Handcuffs that cut into the skin until the circulation stopped and the hands went numb, and the pain became something beyond ordinary pain. Blackjacks applied with the specific purpose of producing damage without killing. Stun guns, staple guns, non-fatal bullet wounds delivered to specific parts of the body, wounds that produced enough blood and enough pain to communicate everything that needed to be communicated about what would happen if the money did not arrive. Everyone paid, because everyone understood what not paying meant. And then someone told them about Fritz, Richard Fritz Simmons, 112th Street in Harlem, the consignment king. Before you understand what the Wild Cowboys did to Fritz, you have to understand what Fritz had built. Because without understanding what he was, you cannot understand why they wanted him. And without understanding why they wanted him, you cannot understand the specific magnitude of the mistake they made by going after him. Fritz had done something that nobody in the New York drug trade had ever done at scale before him. He offered pure cocaine on consignment. No money up front, no collateral, no credit check, just the product. The purest product available anywhere in New York City, and an agreement to pay after it moved. This sounds simple. It was revolutionary. Every operator in the drug trade before Fritz had required payment up front or at the point of transaction. You brought your money, you got your product, you moved it. You came back with more money and got more product. That system had a specific limitation. You could only grow as fast as your available capital allowed. Fritz removed that limitation. A man with nothing, a man with no money, no existing operation, no supply chain, could come to Fritz and leave with product. He could build a customer base. He could generate revenue from that product. He could pay Fritz from what he made, and then he could come back for more. Overnight, broke hustlers became bosses. Men who had been on corners for years without ever being able to build anything beyond week-to-week survival, suddenly had product they had not paid for, yet moving through operations they had built from scratch using Fritz's system. Fritz had created an entire generation of New York drug operators who owed their position to one man on 112th Street. And Fritz was not flashy. He did not drive a car that announced what he had. He did not wear jewelry that communicated his position. He did not surround himself with the specific performance of wealth that most men in his situation felt compelled to maintain. He was quiet, calm, focused entirely on the business. He showed love to the people around him, helped them eat, built his organization through genuine relationships rather than fear, through the specific trust that comes from being the man who gave people opportunity when nobody else would. Nobody could find him if they did not already know where to look. That invisibility was his armor, and then the Wild Cowboys found a way through it. They went after his girlfriend first. Not Fritz directly, not the business, the person he cared about. The woman whose presence in his life represented the specific human vulnerability that every man carries regardless of how carefully he has constructed his professional armor. Gunmen forced their way into his girlfriend's home at gunpoint. They were not there for the money primarily. They took cash. They took jewelry. But what they took with the most deliberate intention, what they chose from everything in that apartment to carry with them when they left, was one specific item, her favorite ring. They took it because it was hers, because it was recognizable, because when Fritz received it back, he would understand immediately that whoever had sent it had been inside a space that only people he trusted knew about, that they had been close enough to know what she valued, that the reach of what was coming extended all the way to the most private part of his life. A messenger appeared on 112th Street in a Jeep. He found Fritz. He handed him a package, inside a note, and the ring. The message required no translation. "We know who you are. We know where the people you love sleep. We know what she wore every day. We took it from her. This is what we can reach. This is what we will take from you if you do not respond correctly to what comes next." Fritz held the ring. He read the note. He said nothing, but something was already in motion inside his organization that he had not authorized and would not have authorized if anyone had asked him. A man named Hen Dog, one of his associates, a man who wanted to demonstrate something, his loyalty, his usefulness, his specific value to Fritz and to the organization that Fritz had built. A man who understood that the messenger in the Jeep was a link in the chain, that the person who had delivered that package to Fritz on 112th Street was connected to whoever had gone into his girlfriend's home. Hen Dog spotted the messenger in a restaurant. He did not call Fritz. He did not ask permission. He walked into the restaurant and shot the messenger dead. The link in the chain was gone, but the chain was still there. And now the Wild Cowboys knew exactly who had broken it. The fake cops, they came for Fritz personally. He was on 116th Street, moving through Harlem the way he always moved, without announcement, without the specific visibility that made men easy targets. Just a man on a block, unremarkable, unannounced. The same invisibility that had kept him safe for years. They pulled up, badges out. Police. Fritz had a fraction of a second. Something was wrong. The specific way these men moved, the way they had positioned their car, the energy of the stop, the particular quality of men who were performing an arrest rather than conducting one. Something in the accumulated intelligence of years of navigating New York's streets told him in that fraction of a second that these were not police officers. He made a decision. He screamed. Not ran, not fought, screamed. Loud enough and with enough specific purpose that the block around him could not continue with its ordinary business. Loud enough that people stopped and turned and looked. The Wild Cowboys needed people not to look. The entire system, the badges, the handcuffs, the waiting car, depended on moving fast enough that bystanders saw only what they expected to see, a police stop, until the man was already in the car and the car was already gone. Fritz made that impossible. A crowd forming around a screaming man is not a situation that the Wild Cowboys could manage. They could not produce identification for actual police officers who might respond. They could not explain the handcuffs to a gathering crowd. They could not complete the operation in front of witnesses who were actively paying attention rather than passively observing. They left. Fritz stood on 116th Street, still there, still breathing, but understanding something that required immediate attention. They had known he would be on that block, not approximately, not in the general vicinity, on that specific block at that specific time. That information had not come from surveillance. Surveillance produces general patterns. This was specific. Someone had told them. Fritz started accounting for everyone who knew his movements. The specific process of elimination that a man conducts when he understands that the threat did not enter from outside, but had been cultivated from within. That the information which had made him vulnerable, which had told the Wild Cowboys where to find him and where to find his girlfriend and what she wore on her hand, had been given by someone he had allowed into his circle. He went through the list. Someone on his own block on 112th Street. Someone who had been present long enough and trusted enough to have access to the specific details that a crew from Washington Heights could not have gathered through observation alone. He found the answer. Days after the failed kidnapping attempt on 116th Street, the mole was shot and killed. The specific message that a man sends when he has identified who sold him. When the accounting is complete and the answer is clear and the response is the only response available in a world where the courts are not an option and the police are not an option, and the only language that means anything is the language that the Wild Cowboys themselves spoke fluently. The mole was gone. Fritz was still there. The Wild Cowboys' end came the way that all organizations built on unlimited violence eventually end. They could not stop, even when stopping was the only rational move, even when the scale of what they had done, the bodies, the ransoms, the witnesses shot and slashed, the 42 members operating across multiple boroughs had made them the kind of target that the NYPD and the DEA devoted years and serious resources to dismantling. They could not stop. A wanton act of violence on the West Side Highway, a killing so public, so reckless, so lacking in the specific operational discipline that had allowed them to operate for years, finally gave investigators the thread they had been waiting for. The NYPD pulled it, and everything attached to it came loose. Lenny Sepulveda, Nelson Sepulveda, Fat Danny, Platano, Pascualito. One after another, the core members of the Wild Cowboys were arrested, charged, convicted. The specific legal machinery that had been building the case for years finally produced the result that Washington Heights had been waiting for, with relief and with grief and with the specific complexity of a neighborhood that had been terrorized by these men and had also watched them grow up. Robert Jackall, a professor from Williams College who had spent years embedded with the NYPD detectives and prosecutors who worked the case, published the definitive account through Harvard University Press in 1997. Wild Cowboys, the most feared extortion crew in New York City history, documented, analyzed, preserved in the permanent academic record of what the crack era produced in the specific geography where it was most concentrated. And Fritz, the consignment king, the quiet man on 112th Street who had turned broke hustlers into bosses by fronting them pure product with no money down, who had built his empire through relationships and loyalty and the specific organizational intelligence of a man who understood that the most durable power is the power that nobody can see. He held his girlfriend's ring when the messenger brought it back in a package. He screamed on 116th Street when the fake cops came. He found the mole in his own organization and addressed it with the directness of a man who had no other option, and he outlasted them. The Wild Cowboys, who had kidnapped dealers from barber shops and laundromats and restaurants across New York City, who had used stun guns and staple guns and non-fatal bullet wounds to collect six-figure and seven-figure ransoms from the most dangerous men in the underground economy, could not collect from Fritz Simmons, because Fritz was dangerous in the way that the most powerful men have always been dangerous. Not loudly, not visibly, not in any of the ways that the Wild Cowboys understood how to counter, quietly, invisibly, in ways that you do not understand until you have already made the mistake of underestimating him. The Wild Cowboys made that mistake. They did not make it twice. Harlem, 116th Street. Two names ruled this block. Nicky Barnes, the man whose face ended up on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. The man whose notoriety triggered a personal order from President Jimmy Carter to dismantle his operation. The most feared heroin kingpin in Harlem history. Frank Lucas, the man who went directly to Southeast Asia for his supply, who smuggled product in the coffins of American soldiers coming home from Vietnam, who built a $100 million operation that the DEA spent years trying to understand, who Denzel Washington would eventually play on the big screen. Two legends, two men who defined what power looked like in Harlem. And then a third man arrived, from Greenville, South Carolina. Nobody knew his name. He had no connect, no crew, no reputation that preceded him, just a young man from the Deep South who had come to New York City because New York City was where you went when you had decided what you wanted and were willing to do whatever it took to get it. By the time he was done, Nicky Barnes would be begging him for a favor, and Frank Lucas would be trying to use him as an informant from inside a shared prison cell. Both of them would fail. His name was Cody Griffin. The streets called him King. And this is the story of the man who humiliated both of them. Cody Griffin started from the absolute bottom. Not the bottom that most men in Harlem started from, not the projects, not the specific infrastructure of poverty that New York City had been building for decades. The actual bottom. He arrived in New York from Greenville, South Carolina, with nothing but the specific ambition of a man who had looked at what his hometown was offering and decided it was not enough. He started gambling, not as a side hustle, as a profession. The specific skill-based economy of dice and cards that has sustained men in black communities since before the Great Migration. An underground economy that rewarded the same qualities that legitimate business rewards. Mathematical intelligence, risk calculation, the ability to read people across a table and understand what they are going to do before they do it. But gambling had a ceiling. Cody could see it. He looked around at what was actually generating money in Harlem in the 1960s and 70s, at the men who had real money, not gambling money, not the kind of money that could be lost in a single bad night, but the kind of money that built things and bought things and changed what was possible, and he made a calculation. He started pitching $10 capsules of his first product. Not because that was his destination, because $10 capsules were the entry point, the specific bottom rung of an industry he was going to climb. He worked on a 70-30 split, $3 for every sale. But here is what separated Cody Griffin from every other man standing on a corner with product. He could see 150 people in less than an hour, 150 customers in under 60 minutes, $450 per hour. Not because he was pushing harder than everyone else, because he understood something about volume and efficiency that most street-level operators never figured out. Speed mattered, consistency mattered, showing up every single day mattered more than any single transaction. He saved $4,500, bought his own supply, became his own boss. He was not yet 20 years old. He cultivated an image that had nothing to do with what most men in his position were projecting. No flashy car, no jewelry announcing what he had, no performance of wealth that would make him a target before he had the infrastructure to defend what he was building. He wore fedora hats, designer sweaters, suits. He looked like a businessman. Not the street businessman that the crack era would eventually produce, with chains, the bubble goose, and the specific uniform of visible underground wealth. A legitimate businessman, The kind of man who might work at an insurance company or manage a small firm in Midtown. He did not drink. He did not use his own product. 2 rules, non-negotiable, because Cody Griffin understood something that took most men in his position years and multiple failures to learn. The men who lost everything lost it because they got high on their own supply or got drunk and made decisions that sober men would never make. He watched it happen to men around him. He made different choices. He established 116th Street as his headquarters, built his team, earned his territory not through violence primarily, but through the specific organizational discipline of a man who showed up every day, delivered consistently, and treated the people working for him with enough respect that they stayed loyal. He was building something, but that had a ceiling too. He found that ceiling when the police found him, arrested on a possession charge, sitting in a cell, thinking about the specific mathematics of what he had been doing and what was available to him when he got out. The man in the next cell told him something that changed everything. Heroin, triple the money, the same infrastructure, the same territory, the same organizational discipline he had already built. But the economics were completely different. The margins were larger, the demand was deeper. The specific economics of the new product created a customer base that returned with a consistency the old product could not match. He made the switch. He branded his product, a cat head stamp. He gave it a name that Harlem remembered, and he claimed it was the purest product on Harlem streets. He was not lying. The purity was his competitive advantage, the same strategy that Fritz would use decades later on 112th Street, the same understanding that quality creates loyalty, and loyalty creates volume, and volume creates the kind of money that changes what is possible. His operation expanded to Riverside Drive. That expansion brought him into the orbit of something he had not fully anticipated. Nicky Barnes. Barnes's crew noticed what Cody Griffin was doing on Riverside Drive, the specific quality of his product, the discipline of his operation, the organizational intelligence of a man from South Carolina who had arrived in Harlem with nothing and built something that the most sophisticated operators in the city were watching with genuine interest. Barnes sent word. He was willing to help. Cody Griffin went to meet Nicky Barnes, the most feared heroin kingpin in Harlem, the man whose organization stretched across 5 boroughs, the man who had built the council, the specific consortium of Harlem's biggest operators, as a governing structure for the city's heroin trade. Cody asked for 1/8 of a kilogram. Barnes looked at him and refused, not because he didn't want to do business, because 1/8 was too small. Barnes would not sell 1/8 to a man he respected enough to meet with personally. He told Cody directly, "I won't sell you that little. If you want to buy from me, you buy a 1/2 kilo, a 1/2 key, minimum." Think about what that meant. Nicky Barnes, the most powerful heroin distributor in Harlem, was telling a young man from South Carolina that he believed in his operation enough to force him to buy bigger, to graduate him, to insist that Cody operate at a level that matched what Barnes saw in him. Cody bought the 1/2 kilo, and then he graduated to a full kilogram, $170,000 for a single key from Nicky Barnes, in cash, from a man who had started pitching capsules on a 70-30 split. He tried Frank Lucas, 114th Street, the man who had gone directly to Southeast Asia for his supply, who had built a $100 million operation that the DEA spent years trying to understand, who would eventually become a household name through the specific alchemy of a Hollywood film and a star performance from Denzel Washington. Frank Lucas was the most talked about name in Harlem at that moment. His product was moving. His reputation was spreading. The specific mythology of a man who had gone directly to the source, who had cut out every middleman, every connection, every layer between himself and the supply, was generating the kind of awe that Harlem reserved for men who did things nobody else had figured out how to do. Cody Griffin went to Frank Lucas, man to man, operator to operator, trying to do business. Frank Lucas refused to sell him anything larger than quarter bags. Quarter bags, the smallest retail quantity on Harlem streets, the unit that corner dealers bought when they were getting started, the entry-level transaction that most serious operators had graduated past years ago. The same Frank Lucas who was running a $100 million operation, who had soldiers across multiple boroughs, who had supply coming in quantities that the federal government would spend years documenting, looked at Cody Griffin and would only sell him quarter bags. Think about the specific contrast. Nicky Barnes, the most feared heroin distributor in Harlem, the man on the cover of the New York Times magazine, had personally upgraded Cody from an eighth to a half kilo because he saw something worth investing in. Frank Lucas, who had built something even larger, saw nothing worth acknowledging beyond the smallest possible transaction. Two men, two assessments of the same person. Barnes saw the future. Lucas saw a small-time dealer. That difference in judgment, that specific gap between what Barnes understood about Cody Griffin and what Lucas missed, would eventually tell you everything about the kind of operators each of them actually was. Cody kept building. He did not need Frank Lucas. He had Nicky Barnes. And Nicky Barnes was enough. His organization reached its peak when he was still barely past 20 years old. $50,000 per day. That was what his operation generated at its height. Not $50,000 in a good week. $50,000 on a good day. On a bad day, $30,000. The specific distinction of a man whose worst days were better than most operations' best days. He expanded beyond Harlem. Detroit sold Baby Ray Peoples a half kilogram of uncut supply for $100,000. One transaction, one city, $100,000 moving from New York to Michigan through the specific network of trust that Cody had been building since his first day on 116th Street. He was moving supply across state lines with the organizational confidence of a man who had already figured out that the biggest money was not on any single block, but in building a network that connected multiple cities. That understood the specific geography of Black America in the 1960s and 70s, the cities, the connections, the supply chains that moved between them, and could operate across all of it simultaneously. He had more than 20 soldiers by the time he was 20 years old. 20 soldiers, a command structure, an organization. All of it built by a man who had arrived in New York from Greenville, South Carolina, with nothing but the specific intelligence to understand what was available and the specific discipline to build toward it without losing himself in the process. He wore $100,000 worth of jewelry every day. He had front row seats at Muhammad Ali fights. He drank Dom Perignon. He wore furs. He cleaned his money through clothing stores and his own record label. The man in the fedora hat who didn't drink had become something that Harlem's streets could not ignore. And then, in a moment that told you exactly who he was, Nicky Barnes got out of prison and came to Cody Griffin with a proposition, a $1 million deal. Barnes wanted Cody to be the middleman, to broker the transaction, to use the specific network and credibility that Cody had built to facilitate something that Barnes needed done. Cody Griffin said no, not because he was afraid, not because he couldn't handle the logistics, because he had learned something that most men in his position never learn until it is too late. All money ain't good money. If the deal went wrong, if anything went sideways in a $1 million transaction, and Cody was the middleman. Cody was the one holding the liability. He had not spent years building what he had built to become a middleman for someone else's risk. He turned down Nicky Barnes, the man on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, the man who had forced him to graduate from an eighth to a half kilo, said no. The government came for him in 1976. Federal indictment, tax evasion, and drug trafficking, the specific combination that the federal government used against every significant operator who made the mistake of generating visible wealth without explaining where it came from. He noticed the stakeout. He had been about to drop off 4 kilograms. He saw something that didn't fit. He read the geography the way a man reads it when he has been moving through dangerous situations long enough to understand when something is wrong before he can name what it is. He turned himself in. He was sentenced to 15 years in Atlanta. And in Atlanta, in the specific compressed geography of a federal prison facility where the men the government had taken off the streets of America were housed together, Cody Griffin found himself sharing a cell with Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas, the man who had refused to sell him anything larger than quarter bags on 114th Street. The man who was now one of the most famous cooperating witnesses in American law enforcement history. He had given the government names and information and the specific organizational details of operations across multiple cities. He had traded what he knew for what he needed with the specific ruthlessness of a man who had decided that his own freedom was worth more than any loyalty he had built over decades. Frank Lucas was in the business of cooperation, and cooperation required raw material, information, names, cases that prosecutors could build on, the specific currency that men in Lucas's position collected from everyone around them and delivered to the government in exchange for the sentence reductions and the protections that only cooperation could provide. Cody Griffin was sitting right there in the same cell. A man who had operated at the highest level of Harlem's underground economy for years. He knew names and operations and the specific geography of how product moved through New York's streets. He had done business with Nicky Barnes and had connections across multiple cities. Everything Frank Lucas needed. Lucas worked it slowly, the way experienced operators work everything, not directly, not with the crude bluntness of a man asking for something obvious, through conversation, through the specific social engineering of a man who had spent years reading people and understanding how to position himself in relation to them. He started asking about situations, about people, about things that had happened in the specific world they both moved through, questions that seemed like the natural conversation of two men who had operated in the same city and knew the same people. But the questions kept coming back to one thing: murders, specific situations, cases that were open, things that the government had been trying to close for years but could not get anyone to talk about. The specific information that would transform cooperation from ordinary to extraordinary, from a sentence reduction to a ticket out. Lucas wanted Cody to talk about murders. Cody Griffin looked at the man who had refused to sell him anything larger than quarter bags, the man who was now trying to use him as a source of information to trade to the federal government, the man who had underestimated him on 114th Street and was now trying to extract value from him in an Atlanta prison cell, and refused. Not a heated refusal, not a confrontation, not the kind of dramatic moment that gets remembered and retold. A simple, clear decision that a man makes when he knows who he is and what he will and will not do, regardless of where he is or what it costs him. He did not talk. He did 15 years. While Frank Lucas cooperated with the government and eventually walked out years before Cody did, Cody Griffin sat in Atlanta and did not say a word to anyone. The man Lucas had tried to use as a source did his time in silence. The man who had seen Frank Lucas as a small-time dealer, Cody Griffin, had now seen Lucas try and fail at something far smaller than building an empire. Getting information from the man from Greenville, South Carolina. He could not do it. He came home and made the specific mistake that men who have done significant time often make. One more score. The reasoning is seductive. He had built something before. He understood how it worked better than almost anyone alive at that point. He had the connections, the organizational intelligence, the specific knowledge that decades of operating at the highest level produces, knowledge that does not disappear just because a man has been inside for 15 years. He still knew people. People still knew him. The infrastructure of relationships that had made his operation possible was still there, changed, evolved, reorganized around different people, but still there. One more score. He got back into the life. And then in 1985, the DEA and a SWAT team arrived at his penthouse during a party. The specific chaos of a federal raid descending on a gathering of people who had no warning, no preparation, no time to process what was happening before the doors came open and the agents were inside. They confiscated everything, a Mercedes-Benz, millions in jewelry, the specific accumulated weight of years of converting cash into assets, rings, chains, watches, all of it now in evidence bags. $200,000 in cash. And then the photograph. A photograph of Cody Griffin with Eddie Murphy. The DEA had raided the penthouse of a man who was photographed with one of the biggest entertainers in the world, one of the most recognizable faces in American comedy. The man whose career was at its absolute peak. In 1985, Beverly Hills Cop had just been released, Trading Places the year before, Saturday Night Live. Eddie Murphy was everywhere, and there was Cody Griffin standing next to him. The photograph told you something specific about the world Cody moved through, even after 15 years in Atlanta. He was not hidden. He was not cautious. He was at a penthouse party with Eddie Murphy, and the DEA was watching. He beat the case. 24 grams seized, 6% pure. The prosecutor looked at 24 grams at 6% purity and understood immediately that the case was not going to hold. 6% was not a distribution quantity. 6% was barely enough to establish personal use. The specific legal threshold that the government needed to build a meaningful case was nowhere in the evidence they had seized. The case collapsed. He walked out after 10 months. The man who had been photographed with Eddie Murphy, whose penthouse had been raided by the DEA and a SWAT team, walked out of custody 10 months later because the evidence did not meet the standard, and kept going. He was released at 65 years old. 25 years total inside federal facilities. The man who had come from Greenville, South Carolina with nothing, who had learned the game pitching capsules on a 70-30 split, who had impressed Nicky Barnes enough that Barnes forced him to buy bigger, who had turned down Frank Lucas's size and turned down Barnes's $1 million deal, who had refused to cooperate with Frank Lucas in a shared prison cell when Lucas tried to pump him for murder information, who wore $100,000 in jewelry every day, who drank Dom Perignon at Muhammad Ali fights, who made $50,000 per day when he was 20 years old, who spent 25 years paying for all of it, released at 65, King Cody Griffin, the only man who humiliated both Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas at the same time in the same city.